The following is a conversation between Jacob Harold, President and CEO of GuideStar, and Denver Frederick, host of The Business of Giving, on AM 970 The Answer in New York City.
It is a bit ironic that at a time when we have more information and data than at any other time in human history, our ability to predict the future, or even sometimes to make good decisions, has never been less. And one reason for that may be because not enough people are thinking about making this data meaningful or presenting it in a way where it is accessible and truly useful. And that is why the nonprofit sector is so fortunate to have someone like Jacob Harold, the president and CEO of GuideStar, who just happens to be with us now. Good evening, Jacob, and welcome to the Business of Giving.
I'm thrilled to be here, Denver.
Many listeners may have never heard of GuideStar, and I think for those who have, they may be thinking, oh, yeah, the 990 tax form people. Mm-hmm. So let's start by having you tell us, who is GuideStar and what do you do?
You bet. So GuideStar is the largest platform of information about data for nonprofits. And let's just start by saying, why do we even care about having data about nonprofits? And for me, it's to address what I call the elephant in the philanthropic room, which is simply that some nonprofits are better than other ones. Mm-hmm. Some are able to squeeze more good out of the dollars that they spend. And that's not necessarily that those that are not as effective are bad people, but they haven't figured out the most effective way to do good in the world. So a challenge that donors face and that nonprofit executives face and researchers and government officials is trying to find excellence in the field, to learn from it, to make sure it gets the resources it needs. And so GuideStar's mission is to help in that process, to provide the kind of information that what we call the stakeholders of social change, the people who have a stake in the work of the nonprofit sector, that they're able to make good decisions with their time and with their money and with their attention, with their passion. And so we provide data. And historically, that's mostly been, as you said, from the IRS Form 990, the tax form that most nonprofits are required to file. But we realize that that's a very powerful foundation of data, but that none of us would tell our own story through our 1040. And that we need to supplement that with other kinds of information to tell a richer story about nonprofits. And so that's what we're really trying to do at GuideStar right now. And we're having some success. We have about 7 million people each year who use GuideStar.
That's right. And you really get into the inner workings of all this data and how the whole philanthropic system works.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? What kind of background do you have that really instilled that into your DNA?
In some ways it came from the dining room table at the house I grew up in. Both of my parents worked for small community-based nonprofits. My mom worked at an AIDS hospice. My dad worked for Catholic Social Services, providing services to the poorest of the poor in our community. And so over the dining room table, I would hear about the struggles faced by those people who were devoting their lives to try and make the world better. And these were my parents. Mm-hmm. And begin to understand that the institutions they worked in mattered, and the struggles to find funding had consequences for our community. And so after college, in a way, I tried to stay in the family business, and I stayed in the nonprofit sector. But, we all have to rebel in one way or another. So I rebelled against my parents' local focus and decided to work on national issues, and I worked on environmental issues. And I had a chance to work for a whole set of different environmental organizations, Green Corps, Greenpeace, Rainforest Action Network, and I got to know dozens of others. And it became very clear to me in my early 20s that some of these organizations were simply far more effective than others. And it led me to the question, well, okay, how are we going to tackle a great challenge like climate change if we're not sending money to where it can be most effective? And so that led me to really start to wonder, well, how do we build a marketplace for philanthropy that will help us achieve a better world? And that eventually led me to business school and then to my current role.
Interesting. You mentioned a moment ago that you have 7 million visitors a year. Who principally makes up that audience, and what is the number one thing that they're looking for?
Yeah. When GuideStar was first founded, we assumed that the number one audience would be individual donors, and they are a critical audience. But it turns out that our single biggest audience are nonprofit executives that are trying to find a partner organization or benchmark themselves against another. I will say that the first thing that usually brings people to GuideStar is salary data about nonprofit executives. I call that the gateway drug because people come, they're looking for, what does the CFO of this nonprofit get paid? What does the head of programs get paid?
Yeah.
Whether they're
it's negotiating time for them.
That's right. They may be a donor, but very often they are actually applying for a job at this organization. And quickly, though, they realize, oh, there's a lot of other information here that can answer a lot of other sorts of questions for me. And that leads to much more nuanced analysis.
Yeah. It was at the beginning of this year that you gave your nearly 2.5 million nonprofit profiles a facelift of sorts. Actually, it was more like a total makeover. What did you do with them?
So as I said before, historically, our primary source of data has been these tax forms. And, I mean, we all know from filling out our taxes that tax forms they can feel kind of boring. Now, I think that initially, when GuideStar was first founded, we just quickly put up the data, and it sort of reflected the structure of a tax form. But again, that's not telling the whole story of a nonprofit. And so we needed to change the visuals of the site, the user experience, the graphic design, to reflect a more what I call multi-dimensional view of nonprofits, looking at them from many different viewpoints. So we wanted to say the financial data is incredibly important. It provides a baseline, but it's not the whole story. So our redesign was really about saying, well, there's the financial data here, but there's also operational data and data about people and programs and goals and strategies and photographs and video, and that we needed to figure out how to display that visually in a way that gave people the whole picture of nonprofits and not just a partial picture.
Yeah, and that's where the 21st century is. I know that Mark Zuckerberg on his conference call was talking about the fact that they think that Facebook is going to be almost all video in a couple of years, and so many in the nonprofit sector are there with that dense data that nobody really looks at anymore. So it's a great move. Now, nonprofits are asked to complete profiles. For GuideStar about their programs and operations, and depending on the level of detail that they put into these profiles, they get recognized at either the bronze or the silver or the gold level. At least until this past May, when you introduced a platinum level, which I must say you were almost overly excited about. What kind of information will the platinum level require, and why do you think this information is going to be so meaningful?
So as I said, the baseline data we have comes from the Form 990, but we invite nonprofits to come and share additional data to tell a richer story about their work. And about 115,000 nonprofits have added at least some additional data, and about 40,000 of them have reached one of the levels that you mentioned, with bronze being up-to-date operational data, silver being fresher and more deep financial data, gold being answers to questions like, what's your goal, what's your strategy, really describing your programs in a deep way. And then platinum is what we call quantitative programmatic data. So these are metrics, numbers, that describe your progress towards your goal.
Gotcha.
So it could be for a job training program, what is called in nonprofit jargon an output, how many people went through your program. Or it could be an outcome, how many people went through your program and got a job and kept it for a year. The challenge is that the nonprofit sector is so diverse that there's no single metric that we can use to describe a homeless shelter, an art museum, and an environmental advocacy group. We have to reflect the diversity of the sector. So at the platinum level, we've invited nonprofits to come in and choose metrics that are appropriate to them. But where possible, where multiple nonprofits are measuring the same thing, we've identified that so that nonprofits can more directly compare themselves to each other. And we think this is transformational because it's the first time that at the field level, we have data that's really about social change, not just about the organization itself, but about the impact they're having in the world, that reflects the diversity of the field, but also reflects the ways that the field has a sense of commonality and shared purpose. That said, it's going to take us years to evolve the platinum level to a point where it's truly comprehensive. But we're very excited about it, and we've had about 1,000 nonprofits so far. They've shared about 4,000 metrics.
That's great.
And are looking to have that number climb over the next few years.
I bet you are. Well, it really allows them to benchmark themselves against a similar type of organization and maybe even see what some of those organizations are looking at that they hadn't thought about and saying we need to do that as well. Earlier this summer, we had Pearl and Nee, the CEO of great nonprofits, on the program. And they, of course, collect reviews from those who've been helped by nonprofit organizations, the beneficiaries, as well as others, donors and volunteers. And we got into a discussion of their relationship with GuideStar and how the two of you work together to really bring numbers and stories joined together in a way that will really allow donors to make a more intelligent decision. You're a big believer in collaboration and in partnerships. What others have you been working on to try to serve the public in a better fashion?
As we think about building an information system for the trillion-dollar nonprofit sector, it's very clear that we can't do it alone. We have to work with other organizations. Great Nonprofits is a terrific example there where we're able to provide a channel for the Great Nonprofits reviews to be shared with many, many more people. And then it helps to enrich our profiles as well. So there are lots of other partners for us, and they come both on the data collection side, where we get data from, but also on the data distribution side.
Sure.
So there are about 209 partner organizations that are showing our data on their website or in their software, including Amazon.com. Intuit and Google have apps that use our data. The National Donor Advised Funds, a philanthropic giving vehicle of Fidelity, Vanguard, and Schwab, all use GuideStar's data. And so those sort of partnerships...
That's your wholesale partnership there, right?
That's right, yeah. It really is wholesale. So there's the retail on the website and then the wholesale through these partners. And that way, it doesn't have to be what you would call a pull strategy. Hey, come over to my website. It can be a push strategy. Pushing the data out to where people are already operating.
That's right. Go where they're going. They're out.
And then there's so many other critical partnerships for us with organizations like BoardSource that are experts in how nonprofit boards of directors work. They've helped to inform how we ask questions about nonprofit governance. The same with an organization called D5 that works on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the nonprofit sector. We got their advice on how we should most appropriately ask questions about nonprofit staff and board demographics. Our partners at the Foundation Center that have the best data on foundation grants, which is a great complement to our work. So we know we can't do it alone, but the partnerships have to be substantive. And optimally, they need to be automatic, too, so the data is flowing back and forth automatically.
Yeah, exactly. You all do certain things better than the other guy, and if you can join together, it serves the public the best. You encourage these nonprofits to be transparent about their operations, their finances, and everything else. And coming from the school where you want to practice where you preach, you do that by holding a quarterly impact call. Where did this idea come from, Jacob, and what happens on the call?
So this was an idea that I think initially came from our former CFO, James Lum. But it was something, we'd been batting around the question, how do we do a better job proactively sharing with our stakeholders what GuideStar is trying to do, so that no one's surprised, so that they have an understanding of our strategy and how they might fit into that and how it may help them. And we thought about what public companies do. They have a quarterly earnings call where they share with investors.
So that's it.
Well, basically, yeah. So it was inspired by that, but different in I would say, a couple of ways. One is that we're not just talking about GuideStar's financial results, which are really just a means to an end, although we do share that.
Yep.
But we're talking about our programmatic results. What's happened? How many new nonprofits have come and shared data with GuideStar, for example? How many people are getting data from GuideStar or have gotten it in the last quarter? And then what are we trying to do next? What are we struggling with? What mistakes have we made? What have we learned? I will say the one thing that we've been cautious about is that on Wall Street, and here we are in the studio right down near Wall Street, there is this danger, I think, of short-termism.
No question about it.
Of thinking, it's everything happens on a quarterly basis, which if you're trying to build a great company, it takes years or decades. And the same is true for social change. So one thing with the impact calls is we want to make sure that we're being proactively transparent, but that we're still thinking in the long term.
Yep. And that's so important because I think the long term can be lost when everybody wants results and they want outcomes. Everybody begins to design programs that are going to give them the kind of return and outcomes that's going to get them funded again. And that's one of the dangers we have to stay away from. Well, we've been talking about all these different organizations and these parties trying to come together to coordinate this information in an intelligent fashion here in the United States. But the nonprofit world is increasingly global. And you've been working on something called the Bridge Project to begin to address this. What is the Bridge Project and what is its purpose?
Sure. So the Bridge Project is an attempt to create a unique ID number for every nonprofit in the world, essentially a social security number or a VIN number. And that's really important because if different organizations like GuideStar want to share information about a nonprofit that's in Cameroon, we have to know we're talking about the same organization, and having a unique ID helps us do that. So it's a very simple thing, but it's actually quite profound in our ability to collaborate across an organization like GuideStar, and we mentioned the Foundation Center earlier, which is one of the other partners in the Bridge Project. The other two are Global Giving and TechSoup Global. So we now have more than 3 million nonprofits in this database that have these unique IDs, and we're searching for partners to help plug into that system so that we can expand it over time. Because yes, we live in a global world.
Yeah.
Now, one challenge is that the concept of nonprofit shows up almost everywhere in the world, but it's always a little bit different. I mean, my favorite example is in China. They have something called a gongo, a government-organized, non-governmental organization, which reflects the structure of Chinese society.
Yeah, it does.
And some of them do very important work. But so as we think about trying to build a global system to understand philanthropy and the nonprofit world, we have to have something that captures commonality through these numbers, but also reflects that diversity. So that's going to be our ongoing challenge going forward.
It'd be a huge step if that could be done. As a nonprofit, you got to go out there and get funding. So what are your sources of revenue?
So GuideStar is a hybrid organization. So we are a 501c3 charitable nonprofit, but we do have a business model that allows us to cover the majority of our costs through earned revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And so our budget is about $12 million. About $10 million of it comes from earned revenue, and $2 million of it comes from foundations, on average. And we've been very lucky to have support from significant foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, Kellogg Foundation, Barr, Packard, and others. And they like that we're able to cover most of our costs through earned revenue. But I also like that it's not 100%. I like the foundations holding us accountable to our mission. Mm-hmm. So we don't just turn into a data company. We remember that we are a nonprofit that has a social mission.
Yep.
And the foundations constantly remind us of that and force us to make decisions so that what GuideStar is doing is maximizing the good for the field. Now, that $10 million of earned income also creates really good incentives because it forces us to be useful for our users. And they're only going to pay us if it's helpful. Now, 99% of our users use GuideStar 100% for free. Mm-hmm. But there's 1% who are accountants or foundation program officers or lawyers or bankers or consultants who need additional tools, the ability to download customized databases, et cetera. And they pay us for access to premium subscriptions. And then some of our wholesale partners pay us as well for access to bulk data. But it's always a tricky balance. And
yeah,
it
sure it is.
forces us to be as thoughtful as we can be about ensuring that we meet the mission, but also that we pay our bills.
Let me pick up on your point about the funding that you receive from foundations. And back in May, you and your buddy, Phil Buchanan, who is the president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, was a guest on the show back this past spring. You led a group of 21 like-minded colleagues who all signed this letter to foundation executives urging them to invest more of their resources in nonprofit infrastructure. What exactly is nonprofit infrastructure, and what was a specific request you made to these foundations?
So, infrastructure is the stuff that helps make a system work. So when you think about society, it's things like roads or rail or sewers or
things we don't pay any attention to in this country.
Exactly, until they start to go wrong. That's one definition I've heard is that infrastructure is the stuff you don't realize that you need until it goes wrong. And you think about the business world. The business world has an infrastructure. The New York Stock Exchange, Harvard Business Review, investment banks, et cetera. Now we've seen how sometimes that infrastructure doesn't live up to what we as a society need it to be. We saw that in the financial crisis, I would say. The nonprofit sector has an infrastructure too. It's the training programs at universities that help prepare people to be nonprofit executives. It's the magazines and newspapers and radio shows that help to get the word out about what's happening in the field. What are the key questions? Help people wrestle with the challenges that we face. It's organizations like the Center for Effective Philanthropy that help foundations learn from their constituents and get better, or like GuideStar. And these institutions are critical for the healthy performance of the nonprofit community. But they're all a little bit underfunded because people don't like to invest in this sort of infrastructure. So the 21 of us that you mentioned, initially convened by Phil Buchanan and myself, we asked foundations to devote at least 1% of their grants budget to nonprofit infrastructure. That would be a significant leap if they actually did that.
Sure would.
But it still would allow, the vast majority needs to go to the work on education or healthcare or the environment or the arts or whatever issue a foundation is engaged in. But we need that sliver of money to make sure that the underlying systems are there and are healthy.
Have you been happy with the response?
So it's been really interesting. I've been very happy with the ad hoc response, the anecdotal response.
Yes, sure.
Foundation leaders contacting us and saying, "Oh,
great
this
letter.
Is great, really like it. We're sharing it with folks. We're talking to our board about it." But it's too early to know whether it actually has any real impact.
I know what you're talking about. Everybody recognizes its importance. Everybody wants it done, but everybody else wants somebody else to fund it.
Yeah,
because they don't want to fund something that other people are going to be benefiting from, and they're hoping some other guy will pick it up. So I think your idea of across the board at 1% is the right idea, but as you say, we'll see where it goes. Yeah. Of all the topics we have discussed, Jacob, on this show, more than any other, it's probably been debunking the overhead myth.
Yep.
That misguided notion that you can tell the effectiveness of a nonprofit organization by how much of your donor dollar goes to program and how little of it actually goes to administration and fundraising. As a matter of fact, we had Carolyn Fines on the show.
Yep.
She's from Giving Evidence based in over the UK, and she cited some data that showed in looking at the most highly rated organizations on GiveWell, they in fact were the ones that had the highest overhead. You have been a real leader in this right from the early outset, but let me put myself into a donor's shoes for a moment if I can. This overhead number is a really, really nice number. It's simple. It's clean. It does what you mentioned a few moments ago. It allows me to compare that homeless shelter to an art institution. And maybe most importantly, it makes me feel responsible.
Right.
So I get the point that you're making here. So the question I have is there another number or some other indicator that is as clean or simple or nearly as clean or simple that I could use to make an intelligent giving decision? Does such an indicator exist?
So no, it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't exist is that the nonprofit sector is simply too diverse. Just like in the business world, no smart investor is going to only use one single metric to compare the investment of, into a new startup company versus a restaurant versus GE stock. They're just too different from each other. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at data, but we need to give up on the idea that there's a single number. I do think that there's a single word. I will offer the single word, which is clarity. Is a nonprofit clear about its goals, how it's going to get there, and how it knows if it's making progress? And I think that's where having good data can really help. Does a nonprofit have a good metric that they've chosen on GuideStar Platinum or wherever that shows how they believe they should be judged in the unique context of their work? And does that make sense to you as a donor? And are they clear about why they think the things that they're going to do are actually going to lead to lasting results?
Is there any effort in terms of trying to compare like organizations to one another? Like when you talk about in the private sector, you can't compare them all, but if you look at, let's say, retail stores, it's always sales per square foot.
Right.
I mean, are people thinking of doing those kind of verticals for homeless shelters and for education and for medical things, or is that not being thought about?
So absolutely. And I think that could be incredibly valuable to say, look, for homeless shelters, there are 7 metrics that are really quite relevant. And you should look at these, and that will allow you to make smart decisions among homeless shelters, or for art museums, or for international development groups. And we believe that the platinum level on GuideStar is going to help us gather that data and organize it in a structured way so that we can look at one subset of organizations at a time. Now, that said, I will just add some nuance here, perhaps to complicate things. Think about 2 different homeless shelters that are both measuring average number of nights stayed at that homeless shelter. But one homeless shelter focuses on the chronically homeless, people who may have drug addiction problems or mental illness. And another one focuses on the newly homeless, people who just missed a rent check. The second one may want to minimize the average number of nights in the homeless shelter. They want to get them back into permanent housing as soon as possible, whereas the first one that's dealing with the chronically homeless may actually want to maximize it. So we need to be thoughtful about that unique context. But even just raising that question, having that data, forces us to be more thoughtful about the work we're doing and how to do it better.
Yeah, it brings up other questions as well. To use your example, there may be a homeless shelter that's not doing that well, but it's the only one serving a single community.
Yes.
And if you do away with that, well, those people are just going to be really left high and dry. You're a data guy, obviously. Is there any set of data out there that has not been released but could be released, and if it were to be so, would have a profound positive impact on decision-making and problem-solving in the social sector?
So, I mean, you won't be surprised that what I dream of is data from individual nonprofits sharing what they measure to track their own performance, basically the data we're collecting on Platinum. The challenge, of course, is that's not one data set that's fragmented across the entire nonprofit sector. So another answer I'll give is government funding of nonprofits. Now, individual levels of government, the federal government or a given state or municipality, may share data about which nonprofits they're funding and why. But that is also very fragmented. We don't have, and government funding of nonprofits accounts for, depending on how you count, at least $400 billion a year and some really good work. But we don't have that in aggregate to understand how government is outsourcing some of its functions to the nonprofit sector. And is that working? And I think often the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. But how could we get government to share that data at all different levels in an open format that would allow us to learn from these investments that we're making as citizens I think all told, they're very good investments, but let's find the data to show that.
Very interesting. Let me get you in on this. We're in the middle of a presidential election. I'm thankfully going to turn the page to the next one, 2020, because I don't think we can look really intelligently much more beyond 4 years. What does GuideStar look like? What does the world of nonprofit data look like for me and our listeners? When I sit down to my computer or whatever I'm going to be using 4 years from now and search for information about nonprofits, what information do you hope and what information do you anticipate that we will be able to get?
And I'll start by saying I think you're not the only one who's ready to turn the page on this election.
Yeah.
But I do think that 4 years from now, that we will have enough of this programmatic data, the measurements of actual progress made by nonprofits against their goals, and we'll have it organized, as you suggested, within these subsets, homeless shelters over here and art museums over here. And that's going to allow us to think about nonprofits in their unique context in a much more powerful way. And then I would also say that we're going to start to have much more global data. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to take more than 4 years to get to a true global database of all the work done to make the world better. That's going to take decades. But 4 years from now, we'll begin to have linkages with a handful of countries that already have significant efforts. For example, there is a GuideStar in India that's a separate organization that's a partner of ours that has data on maybe 10,000 of the largest nonprofits.
That's a start.
India. And we talk to them regularly and are trying to figure out how could we bring our databases together. So I hope that 4 years from now, we'll have some really good examples of sharing data across national borders, and that we're going to begin to have this programmatic data that actually shows how nonprofits are doing achieving their mission.
That would be great. Getting back to today for a moment, if people want to get more information about GuideStar, where do they go?
So GuideStar.org, GuideStar.org, and lots of information there, 2.8 billion pieces of data, videos, photo, and lots of fun to explore and try and understand all these organizations trying to make the world better.
Well, Jacob Harold, the president and CEO of GuideStar, I want to thank you for being on the show this evening. You are not only a great champion for GuideStar, but for the free flow of meaningful information across the entire ecosystem of the nonprofit and philanthropic worlds. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks a lot, Denver.
The Business of Giving can be heard every Sunday evening between 6 and 7 p.m. Eastern on AM 970 The Answer in New York and on iHeartRadio. You can follow us at Biz of Give on Twitter and at Facebook.com/businessofgiving.